All right, today we're going to dive into a really foundational document from the Holy See called Dilexi Te. It unpacks the Catholic Church's long-standing and, let's be honest, often challenging teaching on caring for the poor. So let's jump right in.
Okay, so here's how we're going to tackle this. We've broken it down into four main parts. First up, we're going to look at the theological why behind all of this. Then we'll get into the historical how, the way this has actually been lived out. Third, we'll explore the what, the big modern challenges we're facing. And finally, we'll wrap up with a personal challenge that the document leaves every single one of us with.
So right from the get-go, the document hits you with these simple but incredibly powerful words. I have loved you. Now, what's really key here is who these words are for. The text explains they're spoken to a community that has very little power, very little influence. This immediately sets this really personal tone. This isn't some abstract academic paper. It's a declaration of love, aimed squarely at the very people who are so often overlooked.
All right, let's dig into our first section, the why. What is the core belief, the theological engine that drives this entire teaching? So what's the big idea here? Well, it really just boils down to this. The document argues that love for God and a real, concrete, active love for our neighbor, they aren't two separate things. They're basically two sides of the same coin. As the text says, they're distinct yet inseparable. In other words, you can't have one without the other. One is basically the proof of the other. And this is where it all really starts to click. The document highlights this specific quote as a massive revelation. The point isn't just, be nice. It's about a fundamental shift in seeing that when you encounter someone who is poor or powerless, you are actually truly encountering Christ himself. That's the game changer here. This isn't just framed as social work. This is theology in action. Okay, so all of this leads to a really key concept, the preferential option for the poor. Now, the document is super clear on this one point. This is a preference, not an exclusion. It doesn't mean God loves other people less. Not at all. It's more about highlighting that God's compassion for all of our human weakness begins with those who are most vulnerable, most oppressed.
Okay, that's the why. So let's move on to section 2 and see how this all builds. This is the how, a history of service. How has this core belief actually been put into practice over the centuries? The document is really clear that this isn't some newfangled idea. No way. It's this golden thread woven right through 2,000 years of history. You see it from the deacons in the very first days of the church, through the fiery social justice sermons of the early church fathers, the big-time theologians, all the way to the radical poverty of orders like the Franciscans, and right up to modern witnesses like Mother Teresa. And this story from the document, wow, it's just incredible. St. Lawrence, a deacon in ancient Rome, was ordered by the authorities to hand over all the church's treasures. So he asked for a day. He went out, gathered up all the city's poor, the sick, the disabled, brought them back and presented them, saying, "These are the treasures of the church." I mean, can you imagine a more powerful statement about what really matters? And that belief wasn't just talk. It translated into real, concrete action on a huge scale. We're talking about the founding of hospitals and entire nursing orders, the creation of Europe's very first free public schools, religious orders whose whole mission was to ransom and free slaves, and, of course, a long, long tradition of helping migrants. It was never just about charity. It was about building entire institutions of care. Okay, so that history brings us right up to today and to our third section, the what, the modern challenge. Because this document isn't just a history lesson. Oh no. It has a pretty sharp critique of our world right now. The text brings up this really crucial term, structures of sin. And the idea here is that poverty isn't always just bad luck or someone's personal choices. A lot of the time, it's baked into the system. It's caused and kept in place by unjust systems, economic and political structures that are kind of set up to benefit some at the expense of many, making it feel totally normal to just be indifferent. And listen, the language the document uses here is incredibly stark. This quote pulls zero punches. It critiques economic models that put market freedom above basic human dignity, calling them a dictatorship and a new tyranny. That really shows you how seriously the document takes these systematic problems. And this leads to what might be the most important shift in perspective in the whole document. It really challenges us to stop seeing the poor as, just passive objects of charity or some problem we need to solve. No. Instead, it pushes us to see them as the main characters of their own story, as the agents of their own change, and even as teachers who have a mysterious wisdom that maybe the rest of us are missing.
It's a total flip from a top-down paternalistic approach to one of real solidarity. All right, that brings us to our fourth and final section, the final challenge. Because after laying all this out, the document kind of turns the spotlight right back on us, the reader. And to really drive the point home, it brings up the famous parable of the Good Samaritan. You know the story, the man beaten and left for dead on the side of the road. And then it asks this incredibly direct, personal question. So I'll just pose it to all of us right now. In that story, which character are you?
The document then breaks down what the Samaritan did and presents it as a model for all of us. It's basically a four-step process. First, he actually sees the person suffering. He doesn't just walk past. Second, he makes a choice. He stops. He doesn't look away. Third, he responds with real, practical help. And finally, and this is so important, in doing all of that, he recognizes that this stranger is just as human as he is. They have the exact same dignity. And the document suggests it's this kind of personal recognition that is the starting point for challenging those larger structures of sin.
And so we're left with this one last, really provocative question that kind of sums up the entire message of Dilexi Te. Is caring for the poor just one of the many things the church does, like an activity on a checklist? Or is it something much, much deeper, something that actually defines its very identity? The document just leaves us to think about that. Thanks for joining me for this one.